it is. There's our brain. Look how big our brain is. Isn't that great? What? It's in the dark in the morning here. How about that? That's better. Okay. So remember that we've got two different places where we're going to be identifying brain structures. One is on the model here itself, and because it's very detailed, this is where you're going to have your longer list of structures that you're required to know. And these are listed in the lab manual on page 11-13, where it says key to the human brain model. So anything in bold is something that we have to know for the lab practical. The handout that you have, at least as of this semester, is the specific structures that we'll need to know for the sheep brain. And you'll notice that the list of structures you need to know for the sheep brain is much shorter than what we do for the model. Because, of course, on the sheep brain, it's a little bit harder to differentiate or tell the difference between specific structures. So with that in mind, we make a shorter list of things that you're required to know. But for the brain model itself, we're using the list that we have in the lab manual. Okay. So there's two halves of the brain that are available for you to review on your table. You'll notice that the lettering is on both sides, so you may refer to one side or the other. And unfortunately, like some of our other models, they do this odd thing where they repeat the letters, and you're like, right? So there'll be a C on this side, and there'll be a C on the other side, and you're like, why, right? We have infinite numbers. Why didn't they just use numbers for everything? I don't know. German wisdom, I don't know. So let's start out then. I'm going to move this out of the way. We're going to start out with the brain itself. We're going to do some of the major brain areas. I know we haven't done it in lecture yet, but some of these you're probably going to be familiar with just from your own biology class or your own experience, etc. So one of the very first things, the largest area of the brain that we know is this big wrinkly area here. So that's the cerebrum. So we can see it on either side, right? All of this is cerebrum that we see up here. And then we have this area down here, which is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has a longer name, but it's a smaller structure. So this walnut-shaped structure here that's on the posterior part of the brain is going to be the cerebellum. So cerebrum up here, cerebellum right there. After that, we have a region of the brain that's called the midbrain. So this area right here is called the midbrain. So it's kind of the area that I'm covering by my thumb right now. That whole area is called the midbrain. Okay, so again, it's like a region, and we will find that there are specific structures that we're going to identify in the midbrain as well. But that's the midbrain as a region. Then we have the pons. So the pons is going to be this big anterior bulge that we see right here. And that's part of the brainstem along with this area that's inferior to it, which is called the medulla. More specifically, it's called the medulla oblongata. So I don't know why recently, like in the lab manual, it just says medulla, because we know that there are other areas of other organs that's called the medulla. It's usually referring to the inner area. Like when 202 right now, we're doing the adrenal glands as part of the endocrine system, and there's a cortex, which is towards the outside, and there's a medulla, which is the inside. So this is the medulla oblongata down here, and this is the pons up above it. So that's helping to make up our brainstem. Then we see that there are different lobes. So the cerebrum itself, there are different lobes of it that correspond to the bones that we learned of the cranium already. So that should be pretty easy. We have the frontal lobe, let me see up here. We have the parietal lobe high and on the sides. We've got the temporal lobe that's on the lateral sides. And then we have the occipital lobe that is in the posterior, right? Technically, there's a fifth lobe as well. So in here, kind of in this groove where it's kind of sandwiched underneath it, is a fifth lobe that's called the insula. But you would have to kind of peel that back in order to reveal it. And since we can't do that on the model, it's not on the list. But it is something you'll hear about or read about when we talk about it in lecture. So frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. Okay? After that, we see that there's something that's labeled K. It's called the lateral cerebral sulcus. So the lateral sulcus is that. Remember how we just were saying there's a little fold here that helps to cover up the insula? So this is the lateral sulcus that we see here. In addition, we're going to find that there is something that is called the longitudinal fissure. So when we have the intact brain like that big, deep groove right there, separating the two cerebral hemispheres, is called the longitudinal fissure. So it's all along here, that big dividing line there. So we have a lateral sulcus, which is not quite as deep, and it's on the lateral side. And then the longitudinal fissure is going to be in between like that. Okay? So longitudinal fissure, I was just throwing it on there because we were talking about the lateral sulcus. It's something that we will hear about, and we may actually see when we get to the list of the sheep brain structures. I think it's on there. Yeah. Okay, so from there, we get into some of our smaller structures. And again, we can see our pons that it was referring to there. Arbor vitae, if we look at that, everybody know what Arbor Day is? You're like, no, I don't get it off from work or school, so I don't care. So Arbor Day is Tree Day. Oh, right? And so when we look inside the cerebellum that we see here, there is this pattern of white matter inside of the gray matter of the cerebellum that somebody thought looks like a tree. So arbor vitae basically means tree of life. So that's what we see here, this pattern of white matter inside of the gray matter. We saw that there was a pattern of gray matter and white matter also with the spinal cord, right? So we saw that butterfly or H-shaped gray matter. But interestingly, the gray matter in the spinal cord is on the inside, and the white matter was on the outside. And now as we're seeing it in the brain, we see white matter is actually on the inside, and the gray matter is on the outside, or more superficial instead. But that pattern is called the arbor vitae that we see there. Fourth ventricle. All right, so when we talk about ventricles, probably the first thing you think about are these chambers in the heart, right? So even though we haven't gotten to that, we'll get to that next semester in 202. 4 chambers in the heart, 2 atria, 2 ventricles, right? Fluid-filled chambers. There are fluid-filled chambers in the brain as well. So we've talked about how there's this cushioning fluid that's called cerebrospinal fluid. We saw when we were looking at the spinal cord model that it goes down through the central canal. It goes in that subarachnoid space, acting as a cushion for the spinal cord. That cerebrospinal fluid is generated inside of spaces or ventricles inside of the brain, and it circulates around the brain as well as within the brain. And there are 4 different ventricles where that cerebrospinal fluid is created and where it flows. So we're going to switch just briefly to this, which is called our ventricle model. Now this is on the handout that we have because it's not in the lab manual and they don't have it at Southern and Dobson, but this is the ventricle model. And what this is it represents those cavities, those fluid-filled spaces inside of the brain. So imagine that this mold, if you will, was made by like sticking, if we have the brain here and we like stuck a needle in there with some cement or something like that, and we're like, we fill up those ventricles, and then we break the brain away, we would be left with this. Okay? So there are 4 different chambers that we call ventricles. The first 2 are these large ones that we see here. So that is one of the what we call lateral ventricles, because this is the midline here. So this is a lateral ventricle here, and this is another lateral ventricle here. So these are the first 2 ventricles that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So those are the lateral ventricles. And then we have this little, if these are rooms, if you will, we also have these little hallways here and here. And I'm sorry that that contrast is not so good. Let me see if we can do this. A little bit better. We got more contrast. And look, there's the list of structures right there too. That's pretty good. So lateral ventricle here and the other C-shaped one on the other side. Connecting those 2 rooms to our third ventricle. Our third ventricle is right here in the center. It almost looks kind of like a bird, right? So you can see there's a hole, there's the eye right there, and here's the beak right there, right? So that room in the center here is the third ventricle. And if we're going to get cerebrospinal fluid to go from the lateral ventricle into the third ventricle, we have to go through this little hallway right here, which is called the interventricular foramen. You can see it from this view. So see these little thin connections here and there? Those are called, each one is called the interventricular foramen. It's between these rooms, between the 2 ventricles, between the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle here. These are interventricular foramen. And, like we said, that leads to the third ventricle. In order to get from the third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle, we go down this long hallway. Let's see if we can get a better angle to it. You can see a little bit there. The long hallway that's here goes down to the fourth ventricle, which is down there. So that hallway over here is called the cerebral aqueduct. So in the Phoenix area, we're pretty familiar with canals and aqueducts and things like that, right? So that's what this is called. This is called the cerebral aqueduct. It goes from the third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle, which is here. The last thing that we can see on this model is you should be able to see that there are these pink structures here in the lateral ventricles, as well as some on the third ventricle, and on the fourth ventricle we see here. Each one of those is called the choroid plexus. And a choroid plexus is made up of ependymal cells. Ependymal cells should be familiar. Those cells are one of our glial cells that we find in the central nervous system that produce cerebral spinal fluid. So collectively, they make up a tissue that's called the choroid plexus. So these pink areas on and inside of the ventricles are called, each one's called the choroid plexus. So that's where the cerebral spinal fluid comes from. Okay? So that's our ventricle model. So now let's go back to the brain, where we can see there's our fourth ventricle. So that space that we see here, just anterior to the cerebellum and posterior to the pons, that space is the fourth ventricle. Remember we said that there's a big hallway, a big channel that goes down to it? That's the cerebral aqueduct cutting through the midbrain right there. So here's a cerebral aqueduct going down to the fourth ventricle. The third ventricle is right here. Remember how we said the third ventricle kind of looked like a bird? There was like a little dot for the eye and a little beak. Look, there's the dot. There's the beak right there. So this space right here is a fluid-filled space. That is the third ventricle. And that is called the intermediate mass. It passes through and connects two halves of a structure of the brain called the thalamus, which is this round structure. And that creates that little eye, which is a hole in the ventricle model for the bird's eye, if you will. So third ventricle is located here. Cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle. We can't really see the lateral ventricles because this is a mid-sagittal cut, right through the middle, and the lateral ventricles are kind of embedded within the brain itself, within the cerebrum. Okay, so let's get back to our list. So it said fourth ventricle, it said third ventricle, so we have those already. Then we had the hypothalamus. Generally, when I go through the brain, I like to go through it like in different areas because it makes more sense, like geographically. But I'm kind of trying to hit the list this way, so it causes us to jump a little bit back and forth. Okay, so in any case, hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, remember how I was just saying that there's this round structure here that's called the thalamus? Okay, so this round structure here is called the thalamus. Hypo means what? Below. So this triangular area that makes the bird beak that we were just talking about, that triangular structure here is called the hypothalamus. So the round area here, this structure is called the thalamus. This triangular area here is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus connects to this structure here, which is the pituitary gland. And it connects to that pituitary gland with a little stem that you can probably just barely see. There's a little stem right there. It's called the infundibulum. And the hypothalamus has direct control over the pituitary gland that's down here. So the hypothalamus is this area of the brain. It has a lot of control centers in it, like for things like hunger and thirst and body temperature. When we talk about a thermostat, and we use that example of homeostasis and the whole negative feedback loop, that's where our control center is for temperature. So that's monitoring for our 98.6 degrees right there. And then some of the responses that it gets in terms of monitoring homeostasis can come out from the pituitary gland, where we have different hormones that are being released. So that's hypothalamus, that's thalamus up there. All right, so let's look at other things in our list. In the list, we get down to corpus quadrigeminus, or corpora quadrigemina. Remember this area right here? That area designated by C, covered by my finger right there, what was that called? Begins with an M. Midbrain. Very good. So this area is called the midbrain. We said that the cerebral aqueduct passes through it. See how there's bumps back here? 1 and 2. And of course, if we put this back with it, there'd be another 2. Those bumps are called the corpora quadrigemina. So we would point out the corpora quadrigemina right here. And the name reflects the fact that there are 4 different structures to it, right? Quad. So corpora, there's 4 bodies to it. There's one, there's another one. This one's called the superior colliculus, that's called the inferior colliculus. They have to do with different visual and auditory reflexes. But collectively, those 4 bumps are called the corpora quadrigemina that we see there. So we had midbrain, this area in here, right? we have the cerebral aqueduct, and then we have the corpora quadrigemina back there. Then we have, up here we were talking about, that's the thalamus and the hypothalamus. If we, again, kind of look at this as a bird maybe, right? So there's the eye of the bird, and there's the beak of the bird. You can see this is almost like a little crest over the eye. That white structure right there is called the fornix. And then this, if it was like a rooster or something like that, this is actually another structure that connects the two different parts of the brain. So much like when we were looking at the spinal cord, we had that commissure going across, right? There was a white commissure and a gray commissure that was connecting from left to right. That's what this does, but it does it in the brain. So this here is called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum allows communication between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So that's our bridge, if you will, in the brain. So it kind of looks like almost like on the rooster or something like that, or a peacock, the top part of the bird right there. Okay, so we have the fornix right there. Then we have the mammillary body. So the mammillary body itself is on the anterior side of the midbrain. And if you go to this part, you can actually see there's a little M right there. So you see that little bump right there? There's our midbrain again. That little bump right there with the M on it, that is the mammillary body. So we can see it on this app as well, but they just have it labeled 48 right there. Okay, so that's the mammillary body. We already did the thalamus, which was this round area right here. And then that's that corpus callosum that we were just talking about. This whole thing is the corpus callosum here. You can see how they have it labeled in different letters right there, but that's it right there. Then it says cerebellum, which we already did. Then it says superior colliculus, and there should be, you would think, an inferior colliculus somewhere. But we said that those are the different bumps of the corpora quadrigemina. So that's the superior colliculus specifically, and then the lower one is going to be the inferior colliculus. But collectively, that's corpora quadrigemina. Cerebral peduncles, that's the last part of the midbrain. We said this area is the midbrain. Now we've discovered that of that area, there's three different structures. On the anterior side here, that is going to be the cerebral peduncle. In the middle here, cutting through, is the cerebral aqueduct. And in the back here is the corpora quadrigemina. So those are all found in the region that's called the midbrain. So this area here is going to be the cerebral peduncles. So this front area, anterior area, is going to be cerebral peduncles. Then there's the cerebral aqueduct. Then there's the corpora quadrigemina. All three of those are making up the region that we call the midbrain. All right, from there it has fourth ventricle, which we already did. The medulla oblongata, which is just inferior to the pons, as we mentioned already. And then we get to some of the cranial nerves. Okay, so with the cranial nerves, we already did spinal nerves. We know that spinal nerves are going to be going into and coming out of the spinal cord and relaying information out to the body, as well as bringing information to the central nervous system. And so these spinal nerves that we see here are going to be doing the same thing for the brain. So cranial nerves do it for the brain, and spinal nerves are going to do it with the spinal cord itself. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So 12 pairs. 12 pairs of ribs as well. That's weird. Illuminati. Yeah. Okay. So 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we have to know. They are, you see that there are some numbers there, and I'll write on the board, maybe I'll put it into a diagram for you, but they are kind of organized on the inferior surface of the brain that we see here. So see all these little nubs? Some of them are going to be, well, most all of them are going to be cut off because we can't have this wire-like extension just kind of sticking out and going everywhere, right? But they do innervate the head and the neck and even down into the thorax. So when we're going through the different cranial nerves, the very first one is right here. So we see here and here. This is cranial nerve number 1. This is the olfactory nerve. So we have olfactory. The second one that we see here and here, those little nubs right there, those are the optic nerves. So we saw optic nerves going through the optic foramen when we were doing the skull. So those are here. So these are the optic nerves. That's cranial nerve number 2. So I'm going to go through the cranial nerves all together. Cranial nerve number 3 is oculomotor. Excuse me. So oculomotor is going to be right at the base. So notice they're kind of in a straight line so far. So there was 1, there was 2, and 3 is going to be right here. So that's going to be oculomotor that we see right here. Okay? So oculomotor is right there, you can see. Or you can see here how it comes in a line. So 1, 2, 3, oculomotor. Fourth one is the trochlear nerve. So the trochlear and the next few nerves are a little bit on the lateral side. So there's our pons, right? That's our anterior bulge. And then see how there's nerves along the lateral side over here? So these are going to be our next few nerves. So here's going to be 4. That's going to be the trochlear nerve. And then 5 is going to be our trigeminal nerve that we see right here. So 4 and 5 are on the side. We had 1, 2, 3 in a straight line. Now 4 and 5 are a little bit on the side here, running in parallel. 6, 7, and 8. 6, abducens. 7, facial. 8, vestibulocochlear nerve. 6, 7, and 8 are all in a line here, more of a horizontal line on the inferior surface of the pons. So this is 6, that's 7, and that's 8. Okay? So abducens, like we were talking about, and then facial nerve, and then that is vestibulocochlear nerve. 6, 7, 8. So then we get to 9, 10, and 11. So 9 is glossopharyngeal, sorry. Glosso means tongue. Pharynx is the back of the throat. So this one's going to help to innervate the tongue in the back of the throat. 9, 10, and 11 are all here along the medulla. So whereas 6, 7, and 8 form this horizontal line like this, now we go back to a vertical line like this for 9, 10, and 11. So 9 is right here. That is going to be our glossopharyngeal. 10 is going to be our vagus nerve, which is going to be down here. And then 11, it says not adequately shown on the model, but generally it's going to be down here. So you can see there's number 40 right there. So it's going to be right down here. So 9, 10, 11 are all in a line over here. And then 12 is our last one. 12 is the hypoglossal nerve, and it's right here. So the hypoglossal nerve we come more medially again. And hypo means under, like we said. Glossal means tongue. So this is helping to innervate underneath the tongue. So for cranial nerves, 1, 2, 3, all in a line. 1, 2, 3. We go out to the side now. 4, 5. 6, 7, 8 in a horizontal line. 9, 10, 11, all kind of in a straight line, a little bit more on the lateral side, and then we come inside here for 12. So those are the different cranial nerves. So for the cranial nerves, we need to be able to identify them on the model. We need to be able to use their name and the Roman numeral, what number they are. So when you see I and you see V and you see X, those are the Roman numerals. Okay? So you have to be able to identify them on the model and use their name and their number. Okay? Now you'd be happy to know we're not doing any functions for them in lab. We will do that in lecture, but not in lab, right? So we're just identifying them. Okay, what other things do we have there? We had an optic tract and a thalamus and a pituitary gland, hypothalamus, mammillary body. Yeah, so we actually did those. So that's good. So the optic tract, we said that this was the olfactory nerve, these here, with a bulb at the end basically. And then we have the optic nerves that we see here. The optic nerves come together, they form an X, like this, which is called the optic chiasma. So they cross over, some of the neurons and the sensory neurons that are in them cross over to the other side of the brain. And so it forms an X like that, which, if you talk about Greek letters, Greek letter chi is X, right? Sigma chi, right? All that type of thing. So the optic chiasma is where these two optic nerves cross together like this. So it's kind of right underneath here. And then we have the optic tract, which is going to continue to go back towards the posterior area of the cerebrum. So the visual information is mainly processed here in the occipital lobe, whereas, of course, the eyes are up here. And so we have to route this information back to the occipital lobe. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the optic tract. It's a continuous path to get back to the occipital lobe. Okay? Okay. So I believe those are all the structures that we have to know for the brain model itself. So we started out with cerebrum out here, working our way in. Corpus callosum that we see here, the fornix that we see there. This little wall that we hear is called the tectum. This is separating the lateral ventricles. This right here is the thalamus. The triangular beak-like area underneath it is the hypothalamus. Back here, oh, do we have pineal gland on there somewhere? Pineal gland, I see it, very last thing on the list. See how there's this pink structure coming off of the eye of the bird, coming off the thalamus? See how it terminates in that little bump right there? That is the pineal gland. Pineal gland secretes melatonin, which helps to regulate your sleep-wake cycle. So that's back here. When we get down to this area, we said this is the midbrain. The little bump coming off of it is the mammillary body. This anterior portion of it here is called the cerebral peduncles. Then our cerebral aqueduct and our corpora quadrigemina that we see there, with our superior colliculus on the top and then inferior colliculus underneath. When we get down to this region, when we get down towards the brainstem, we have the pons and the medulla, our fourth ventricle, and then our cerebellum right there, with its pattern of white matter called the arbor vitae inside of it. Okay? Okay, so for right now then, I am going to leave you with that and give you guys a chance to go through that yourself. And then, in a while, what we'll do is we'll go through the sheep brain, and we'll apply some of what we found here on the model to what we can see on the sheep brain.